Hello, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to the PowerPoint notes of Chapter 10, A Democratic Revolution. We're going to start off today by talking about the rise of popular politics, specifically in the years 1810 to 1828. Now, I know here we go with the 1830s, but and I said it was only going to be till 1828, but you're going to kind of see it will all connect together. So by the 1830s, most states allowed nearly all white men the right to vote. This idea of certain groups being allowed to vote is called franchise or franchisement. It's a word that's still kind of referenced a little bit today as far as voting rights and different things. But by the 1830s, most men are now allowed to vote. It said, John Jay, the first Supreme Court Justice, who you'll see a picture of here on the next slide, he said, "Those who own the country are the most fit persons to participate in the government of it." Obviously, with a statement like this, they want the richer, the upper class, the educated, the white, to be able to be the ones to vote and to be able to run the country. And that's not a true representation of what the country looks like. But in Maryland, they had property qualifications for voting. So you had to own X amount of property in order for you to be able to vote. And many people felt that that was a sign of tyranny. There was also a lot of bribes and corruption within voting and government's assistance, land grants and stocks. And we still even unfortunately have some of that today. Every so often you hear about a politician, whether it's a local politician or on the federal level, who gets in trouble for taking bribes and doing things illegal. You have these groups called political machines. They're not political parties like the Democrats or the Republicans. A political machine is like a group or an organization that's main focus is to kind of push the line and sometimes even cross the line to get somebody specific voted into office or get a specific thing passed. And these political machines, they were very strong, and they wove together the interests of diverse social and economic groups. So you may have XYZ political machine that they focus on cats and protecting cats. And so you get all these other groups that are involved in cats and you bring them together for one main focus. You have Martin Van Buren, who is in New York at the time, and he's known as the chief architect of the emerging system of party government. So when we speak of party government or political parties, that's where like the Democrats and the Republicans come in, and we'll see a picture of him here in a minute. But you have these things also called Bucktail supporters. They were supporting him, and they were in control of the New York legislature in 1821. And there's a word called patronage that comes into play, where basically, if you support somebody in a political position, then you should get something in return, maybe specifically a job type thing. So here we have John Jay, the first Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. Here we have a little cartoon that represents corruption and bribery. You know, here's a politician sitting down at the desk and somebody say, "Buy two, get one free." It works in the grocery store. Why not with politicians? You know, if you buy two off, should you get one free? And then here we have Martin Van Buren, the 8th President of the United States. Good looking hair there. 1824 election led to some serious problems. There were 5 Republicans running for president. So you have John Quincy Adams, who was President Monroe's Secretary of State and the son of John Adams. You have John C. Calhoun, President Monroe's Secretary of War. You have William H. Crawford, President Monroe's Secretary of Treasurer. You have Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, and you have General Andrew Jackson, who is a military hero. So you have 5 people running for office. At the end of the election, there was no clear winner. So they didn't know what to do. So the 12th Amendment comes into play, and ultimately the winner is John Quincy Adams. So if you look here, you can see the different colors, how many electoral votes and popular votes and different things and which states went where. And so because of that confusion, they invoked the 12th Amendment and were able to put in John Quincy Adams. So here you have that image of John Quincy Adams. Now, there were people who supported Henry Clay's American system. They wanted these protective tariffs. Tariffs are like taxes on things brought in or sold to other countries. And the idea was that it would stimulate manufacturing, allow more manufacturing within America. The North The northern part of America said yes, where there were a lot of factories. The southern, where there were no factories, said no, because part of this tariff was also going to put more taxes on the farmers down in the south. They also wanted to subsidize roads and canals and the building of those. So if Moulton Construction Company wanted to go and build a road or canal, I could get money from the federal government to be able to build that. It would help facilitate commerce. Some people liked it, some people didn't. It was mostly defeated, though, and overall people didn't support it. They also wanted a national bank to control credit and provide a uniform currency. Now, at this time, this idea of currency, basically anyone could make up their own, and it wasn't very valuable. Overall, Martin Van Buren was not a very good president. He split the country over the tariffs. John Quincy Adams, we have a real bad tenure of a few presidents here early on in American history. Now, we have Andrew Jackson. His nickname is Old Hickory. He put together a team for the election of 1828. He set up a publicity campaign, going out and meeting people and newspapers and all those things. He also set up mass meetings, kind of like big political rallies of today. Torchlight parades, what those were, is they would have parades at night, and he would be in it, and they would promote him and talk about how great he was. He would have barbecues where people could go and eat. This kind of started the modern day campaigning, and even to this day, we still have those types of things happening. They called themselves the Democrats or the Democracy. So now we start to get a name established with a political party, and they were fighting for equality. Obviously, Andrew Jackson ended up winning, made himself onto the $20 bill. And if we look here we can see, Jackson, Adams, Crawford, and Clay were the four running in 28. And Jackson was the president between 1829 and 1837. Now, this time period is called the Jacksonian era, or the Jacksonian presidency. A lot of different things going on. Once again, there was this idea of patronage. So all those people who helped Andrew Jackson get elected, they felt like they were entitled to a job. So here you kind of have a picture. Right there you have the politician. Yay! All those people behind, they supported him. Now they say, okay, now you need to give us a job. He wanted to destroy that American system, which we just talked about a minute ago, with the roads and the tariffs and the common currency, those types of things. So he vetoed internal improvement bills in the 1830. So basically he said, no, we're not going to extend the national road, and said some of those things should be up to the states, not the federal government. Also during his presidency in the year 1833, Britain ended slavery in the West Indies. Now, this is a big deal because we've kind of modeled a lot of where we are and what we do off of the British, and here they are in 1833 ending slavery. So this big thought is it going to come to America? Is America going to end slavery? In South Carolina, 56% of the population of South Carolina, or the people, human beings that lived in South Carolina, were African Americans. A majority of the people in South Carolina were African American. South Carolina did this thing, an act of nullification. Basically, what they did is they rejected a law passed by Congress. They said, hey, Congress, we don't agree with this law, and so we're not going to follow it. Now, there's a hierarchy, a rule of things. If the federal government creates a law that says the speed limit is 75, but the state says, no, we only want it to be 70, well, legally you're supposed to follow what the federal government says. So here South Carolina is saying, no, we do not agree, and so we are not going to follow this law that the federal government has passed. Well, there's a problem with this. Here you have the one without as much power. Think of it as a parent-child type thing. When the child disobeys, is there going to be a consequence? What's going to happen? And South Carolina threatened something called secession. Secession means to separate themselves from a country, and this is ultimately going to lead up in a few years here to the Civil War. Now, they wanted a second Bank of the United States. This bank was in Philadelphia, and its role or its purpose was to help stabilize the nation's money supply. If you have too much or too little, the value of the money increases or decreases. So they wanted to be able to stabilize it to make sure that things were going to be all right financially. But there was a lot of fear of this second bank, and it spread throughout the United States. Jackson won his election again in 1832. He basically claimed that election as by him being reelected and him being opposed to the bank, that the people, the American people, said the decision of the people is against the bank. So he closed the second bank of the United States and moved the money to the state banks. Now, the big question is if we elect a president, does that mean, or does that allow the president to kind of do what he wants personally with some things? Okay, so whether it's a president who wants to outlaw something, or a president who says this isn't right, and oh, now I got elected, so now does that give me the right to act on behalf of the people to do what I want to do? There's that question, even in today's political world, that theory, that question is kind of prevalent there. By the late 1820s, the South and the Midwest demanded resettlement west of the Mississippi River. So, you know, the colonists had kind of spread out. They were even past the Mississippi River, obviously, at this time, but they kind of wanted things reorganized a little bit. The Native Americans did not want to leave their ancestral lands. Ancestral lands meaning the lands where they had lived for many, 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 many years. And so Jackson did this thing called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Basically, it's exactly what it sounds. Indian removal. Remove the Indians from certain lands. So what Jackson did and others is they set up the Indian Territory in Oklahoma and Kansas. And they sent money and land to the Native Americans and said, okay, here is your new land. Well, some of them didn't want to go, and so Jackson sent in the military to force them to go. You had this thing called the Bad Axe Massacre, that over 8 hours, 850 to 1,000 warriors were killed. We are killing the Native Americans because they won't leave their lands for the lands that the colonists and the people moving west want. 1838, Van Buren ordered General Winfield Scott to enforce the treaty. So the Cherokees are resettle, into the Indian Territory. 15,000 refused, and in March, they were required to march 1,200 miles. This is known as the Trail of Tears, that many of you have probably heard of before. 3,000 died. What this is all over is they didn't want to leave their land that had been theirs and was theirs, that the Americans took, and were forcing them to leave. So here we can see a map. The green are the lands that they gave up, moving to these pinkish lands, specifically in Oklahoma and Kansas area, and kind of the routes that they were being forced to go. Here we have a drawing of the Trail of Tears, moving these Cherokees, forcing them out of their lands, and many of them died in the process. Now, Jackson also said, if to South Carolina specifically, if you threaten to leave, we're going to force you to stay with us. Or if you're going to not follow the rules that we set, we're going to come in and force them. And that's going to lead to more problems, okay? Specifically the time period of the Civil War. States started to change their constitution to allow for more democratic principles. For instance, proportion based on population in state legislatures. So the state legislature would be based on the amount of people, population. So for every, 10,000 people, they would have one person in the state legislature. Voting for most public officials, so more voting instead of appointments. And this thing called classical liberalism or laissez-faire, basically it limits the government's role in the economy. Next comes class, culture, and the second party system. Now, one of these political parties is something called a Whig, okay? So this is what a Whig is. No, not really. Anyways, the Whigs, they were basically the second national party after the Democracy or Democrats, okay, that we just mentioned earlier. In 1834, they identified themselves with pre-revolutionary American and British parties. So kind of the ideas, some of the philosophies and thought processes before the American Revolutionary War. Now, many of them were urban artisans and workers. They also kind of were called the Workingmen's Party. And their agenda or their focus was the values and interests of ordinary urban workers. So, what do you and I, the normal people who have to work each day, not the super rich who just sit at home and swim in dollar bills and gold or whatever, but what do we want? Now, they wanted a just balanced power between classes. They wanted the ending of private banks, and they wanted more public education. So that's kind of what their focus was. During the during the year 1837, there was a financial panic. A panic means it's not quite a depression, for instance, like in the 30s, 1930s, but there's a panic. There was a debt of British manufacturers, American planters, merchants. By 1843, wages fell 50%. So if you were making $1 a week, now you're making 50 cents a week. Unemployment rose to 25%. And this lasted from 1837 to 1840s. And led to some serious financial issues throughout the country. Next, you have Martin Van Buren, who becomes president of the United States. Before the panic, he wanted less government, so he did nothing. He said the government shouldn't be involved. You guys should just deal with it yourselves. They tried that during the Great Depression as well. During the 1930s, didn't work, but that's 100 years in the future. Anyways, Whig, 1840, William Henry Harrison. He was the president. John Tyler, Tippecanoe, which we'll see here in a minute, was the vice president. He was a war hero, encouraged women in campaign festivities, which was the first time. And William Henry Harrison, he died about a month after his inauguration in the year 1841. If I remember the story right, he thought he was a tough guy, didn't want to wear a coat, caught pneumonia, which means you get fluid in your lungs and bad things happen, and he died. So now we have John Tyler as president of the United States. But the big question was, oh my goodness, the president dies. Who becomes president now? The Constitution was vague. Now that's very clear. They've specified a line of secession. But ultimately, Tyler gets kicked out of the Whig Party because of some of his actions. So here we have a William Henry Harrison and John Tyler poster. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison for president of the United States. Okay, but ultimately John Tyler right here becomes president of the United States. Now, let's jump all the way back. So, that is Chapter 10, A Democratic Revolution. Kind of talking early to mid 1800s and its political crisis. It was one after another. Things really were not going well politically.